It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. My name is Brian Wilson, and with me, as always, is my wonderful co-host, Andy Grabner. Good morning, Andy, or good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon here. At the time of the recording, it's already dark outside because it's still winter, and the sun is just, escaping at least this part of the world too soon in the day.
Yeah, well, that happens.
Yeah, it does.
Every day. Every day the sun goes down, and then every day the sun comes up the next day. The sun will come out. All right. Anyway, I'm sure everybody wants to hear me sing. How have you been, Andy?
Not too bad. At the time of the recording, I just spent a week in Greece, thanks to our friends from Neotis who organized the PAC event, the Performance Advisory Council. I want to give a big shout out to Henrik and Stefan who organized the event. It was great. Great event and great location.
Yes, and I think we're going to be having a guest from there soon, so that'll be wonderful as well. Mm-hmm. Always a lot of great things that come out of those performance advisory councils that they set up. So I am really excited to hear from you at some point, some new things we learned from that. Mm-hmm. And speaking of new,
exactly.
we're gonna go to the old, but good old. Right, we're gonna reach way back today. And thank you for reminding me and looking this up. I think it was 3 years ago. What episode was it, Andy?
It was episode number 12.
Episode number 12. We had a guest. And a lot of time has passed, and a lot of new things have been worked on by our guest, and now he's returning. Would you like to introduce our return guest, Andy?
Yeah, of course. So back in 3 years ago, episode 12 was called Automating Performance into the Capital One Delivery Pipeline. And it was Adam and the way I pronounce his last name with my German background is Auerbach. But I guess we want to hear from Adam itself, how he's pronouncing his last name. And also, Adam, I want to know, a lot of things have changed over the last 3 years. You moved on from what you did at Capital One back in the days. And I think you also changed a little bit your scope from CI/CD pipelines, DevOps into DevSecOps and DevSecTestOps, which is the topic we're going to talk about today. So Adam, welcome back to the show. And, tell us more about what people should know about you, and then we dive into the topic.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And thanks, Brian, for having me back. I can't believe that was 3 years ago. I remember sitting and having conversations with you. Auerbach. Every time I go into Germany, into Frankfurt airport, the person at customs says, "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" And I say, "No." And your name is Auerbach. How could you not speak German? My experience at Capital One was fantastic. It seems like for me, that was like higher level education, where they were with DevOps and moving to the cloud and getting to continuous delivery. And, that helped me take that experience and parlay that into consulting. So I work for a company called EPAM Systems. It's a US-based company, but most of our resources are offshore in Eastern Europe, so Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. And then we have, of course, resources across the EU and India and North America. It's about 36,000 employees, over $2 billion in revenue. And so as part of EPAM, I am the co-head of what we call our Cloud and DevTestSecOps group. So when I joined 2 years ago, testing was a separate practice. DevOps was a separate practice. There wasn't really security at all, and cloud was still forming. And so myself and the gentleman who was leading the DevOps practice, we created this big conglomerate. It's 9,000 people at EPAM. And basically what we said is that, the market has changed. They're now trying to do what Capital One has done. They're trying to move to the cloud. They're embracing DevOps and Agile, and they're struggling. Their testers need to change the way that they're working. Developers need to architect and code differently. as you want to move to the cloud, you need to have all of these pieces in place. So we built this practice as a way to help transform the resources at EPAM, but also build out a suite of open source accelerators and have a go-to-market strategy that best suits the evolving needs of our customers. So I've been here for 2 years now, and we've had many engagements like Capital One where we're coming in and helping build out the business case and baseline the KPIs around why someone is transforming. And then we have a whole engagement model to help drive transformation, whether it's just CI/CD or testing, or if it's everything because, you're moving to the cloud or you want to modernize. So it's been really exciting. Last year I traveled 42 times to 9 different countries.
Wow.
I've been meeting a lot of great people and just talking to a lot of diverse companies, and a lot of the same struggles are there for everybody, but it's been a really great experience so far.
Mm-hmm. Hey, before we dive into the details of DevTestSecOps and what people kind of can learn from you and on what you guys are doing and kind of telling your clients, let me go back what you just said earlier. You said you typically go in and then you try to find out what's the business case, and I would be interested in what are the typical business cases or the KPIs that you try to optimize and make better with your initiatives? Because I talk a lot with a lot of people, and they always say, well, we know that automation is important. We know we have to invest here, but what's the real benefit in the end? And kind of, I know this is a tough question maybe, but what are the things where you sell to the business that this is why we need to invest a lot of time in automation, where we need to invest in education, where we need to invest into the cloud? What are the typical business drivers and business motivations that allows a company to say, okay, we're really putting down money because now we understand the business benefit?
Yeah. So, what surprises me is that most people don't understand how well or not well IT is performing. And so that's what we do. We spend maybe 6 to 8 weeks looking at applications. And what we do is we document the entire value stream. So we do value stream analysis, and we look at everything from how the application is architected, the branching patterns, looking at what's automated and manual from a CI process, and then documenting all of the times. And so from a metric perspective, the first one is lead times. So how long does it take? And a lot of the metrics that I'm going to quote from are referenced from DORA, DevOps Research and Assessment, and the State of DevOps reports. But lead time is usually the first one. How long does it take for a commit to work its way through all of your non-prod environments and get to production? So that's the first metric that we look at. And that gives us a baseline. And then from that, we can pinpoint specific inefficiencies within the process. If let's say they have monthly releases, how much of that monthly release is now spent on testing? How much of it's spent on manual activities? How much is spent on rework? And so we can start to create a business case around time to market and efficiency or effectiveness of the productivity of the team. So if I can tell a client, hey, we're going to be able to get new features out the door faster, maybe twice as fast, maybe going from quarterly to monthly or monthly to biweekly or to daily. That's one metric. The other metric is productivity on the teams. So we can look at the backlog of the team and say, how much time and effort are they spending on fixing defects, production issues, just the churn amongst themselves, be able to look at some of the history within Git to see what they're doing. And we can come up with some metrics around developer productivity so that we can then say, hey, not only can we get you to market faster, we can put more into your releases because of the opportunities with waste. And then production quality is the other one. This represents a real cost that the teams are facing. So if they have more than 5% of defects leaking to production, that's a real cost. And so that's the third one, where the true cost savings by being able to implement true quality gates, be able to maybe change some of their processes and how they work. Like to us, like this is how we help not only educate them on what's bad and why it's bad, but then the opportunity for the business that if they make this investment, here's what they should expect on the return.
Mm-hmm. So what's always interesting for me is, I mean, it's great that we have companies like yours that you're working for right now, EPAM, and others that are coming in and helping organizations figuring out what's going wrong right now and how to improve things. What still always puzzles me is how can something actually end up in a state like this where people don't even know what's going on and where they have to ask for outside help to sit down and do something quote unquote basic as a value stream analysis. I know it's not that easy, but still it's not a concept that is completely new. But I guess it just sometimes takes external folks to come in and bring an outside perspective and actually then get people on the table and say, let's sit down, let's look at the things, and let's figure out, what we can improve. But again, it still puzzles me sometimes that organizations get to the stage where one side does not at all know what happens with the artifact once they push it over, and where things are manual and where things are broken. Right?
Yeah, they're just it's a great point. It's not how people are rewarded or recognized. It's not something that is asked to be tracked. And sometimes companies just, they've been through a lot in their history. And so they lose the perspective of like taking a step back and looking at what's going on. They're just kind of happy with the progress that they've made. And then also like they just get kind of stuck in like, this is how it's always been. Yeah. Or, these problems we've always faced. And so like it is what it is and we can't do anything about it. And, we don't like, we do sell the assessment, like you can buy it. But the goal is not to do an assessment for the sake of assessment. The goal is to, drive improvements. But it's just, I could probably go on, it's probably a whole nother podcast around different motivations around why people don't see it for themselves.
I think it's as easy as looking at, like, if you have kids, you know that you tell your kids something is cool or something they should do, try this vegetable or check this out. And all they do is resist, and it just takes someone from the outside to do it. I was trying to teach my daughter how to ride her bike a few years ago, and it was just fighting me the whole time. And then her sister's caretaker was like, "Oh, I'll take you to the park and show you." And she looked up to her as an outsider, and end of the day, she was riding her bike. I think a lot of it comes into just human nature of those close to you. You don't quite listen to or take their value of what they're suggesting to heart, as opposed to when it's somebody from the outside, especially if you're paying somebody from the outside as a paid consultant to come in and look at this. I think it's just a lot of human nature involved in that aspect.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of these companies, they go to conferences, they read books, there's wonderful podcasts like this. And so they try to take some of that information and apply it, but they don't have all of the context and experience. And so, you see that with Agile right now, where many people would say, yes, we're Agile. We have teams, we have backlogs.
We don't have chairs in our meeting rooms.
We do stand-ups. But then as an Agile expert, like if you actually go in and look at what they're doing, many of them are still waterfall, right? They're not delivering working code to production every sprint. They still require some type of release readiness. There are activities that are happening outside the team, and they just don't have that, that experience to understand that, like, yes, some of the things that you're doing are good, but you've missed the boat in other areas, and that's, you're not getting the value for why you did this in the first place. And the last thing I'll say about it is, like, as a consultant, I have to justify the cost. I have to justify the experience, why you're going with us. And so for me, I have to have this point of view to do a discovery, to be able to baseline and be able to educate and then deliver. But when I was at Capital One, to some extent, like I could just go. If I was able to at least have a conversation and get someone bought into what I wanted to do, like I could just do it. No one, like I never really had to make too much of a business case for something. I never had to go back to metrics and argue my case. And I think that's the other piece here is just like company cultures don't require business cases and justification and metrics around value. And, so, there's no reason to look at it differently.
Yeah, it's a great point. So coming to thanks for that, right? I really wanted people kind of to understand, why, what are the business drivers, or how can somebody that wants to change something actually approach that change? And sometimes it just means, reach out to somebody external, like you, in your profession, and then bring them in and then figure out through a value stream analysis where things are not perfectly working, and then optimize from there. Now, coming back to the main topic, DevTestSecOps. First of all, I'm sure you hear this a lot, but why do we artificially create a lot of new words around DevOps and then put more stuff into the middle? Obviously we do the same thing, right? We come up with a lot of words that kind of are sexy to read, and then hopefully get people to get the attention of people. DevTestSecOps. Can you give me a little background on why this is different to DevOps? Why this is different to DevTestOps or DevPerfOps? What's the special thing about DevTestSecOps?
Yeah. So what I find is that people still don't understand DevOps. You still get people who ask, like before we did this recording, I had a salesperson reach out to me and say, "Hey, I have a client. They're interested in DevOps," and I asked him, "What does the client mean by DevOps?" And then he said, "I don't know." And then he went back in his emails, and the client's definition of DevOps is operational support for their infrastructure and applications. There are people who think about DevOps as just automation for CI. And then there are those that really understand about DevOps being a philosophy around flow and quality. And so that's the first challenge is while DevOps is a wonderful movement and a wonderful word, people, it's just so vague right now. There are DevOps engineers and DevOps organizations and DevOps quote unquote tools. And so because like DevOps itself has become so overused, it's just not, it's lost some of its meaning and sense. So, we came up with DevTestSecOps a little bit tongue in cheek. Number one, every time we say the name, everyone has the same reaction where they smile and laugh.
And their eyes roll, right?
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, we could have came up with a better name. But at the end of the day, to really do DevOps, you have to take all of these things into account. Now, granted, CI and automation, testing, performance, security, it's not that's probably not all of it, right? It also includes infrastructure and architecture and branching, and there's other aspects that are included, but these are the areas where we see like the biggest opportunity. People have started to automate their CI. They are understanding that they need to shift responsibilities to the agile teams and the developers to do more things, that the team has to have holistic ownership of being able to ship working code into production early and often. But we still see that performance and security are left out. We still see that while they're focused on CI and the cloud, they haven't really addressed testing yet, or they're minimizing the impact of testing. And so that's, right now, DevTestSecOps is there because these are the glaring opportunities that they have not addressed yet.
Well, and I would say especially security, right? I mean, we had too many incidents, let's call it that way, too many incidents over the last years that were shining a bigger spotlight on security. And then the question is, how can we address security not only when it's kind of too late and then just mitigate the impact by trying to fix the holes fast in production and making sure that not too much information has leaked, to how can we prevent this? And how can we bake this into your delivery process? How can we bake this into your mindset of your organization, right? Security has to be, I would assume, a non-functional requirement, just as performance should be and scalability should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's, back in the day, when computers were getting faster and the internet came around, performance was the big thing, right? That, websites were crashing, they couldn't handle demand. And so now we had to start having performance tests. And then the reaction of the, corporations was, let's go create a performance testing organization. They're going to bring in the tools. They're going to do all this work. And what ends up happening is you get this big bottleneck, this bureaucracy that people don't want to deal with. And so there's, performance testing happens really late at the game. And if they find something really big, most likely they're not going to address it until a future release, and it still has to be prioritized. That has since changed as tools have changed, and now we have many more devices and interactions, and performance really has become first-class citizen, because if my app on my phone takes anything more than a second to load, I'm going to freak out and move on to the next application. So I see like the same thing has happened in security that happened in performance, where we created these security organizations. We then said everything has to go through security testing, or at least at some point during the release, we have to certify it. Then there's this, process for sending your binaries to do dynamic scans or pen tests, etc. And it becomes like a burden on the team. And ultimately, they're just trying to do the bare minimum to check the box, and then ultimately they'll have an issue if they do it at all. And so this is why, DevTestSecOps or DevSecOps is so important, because it really has to evolve like functional testing has evolved, like performance testing has evolved. It has to be in the pipeline. It has to be a gate. It has to be part of many gates. And we have to get more integrated into the way developers are working, so that it's not as painful. It's easy to understand why something is throwing an error, and be able to resolve it quickly. So, the short answer is, like, as people are setting up their pipelines, security has to be part of that equation. And so we need to be able to look at, okay, we're doing a pull request. Well, like, what security tests can we do right now? Can we do the static security scans? Can we do code smells? How do we bake this into a gate so that if there is an issue, it doesn't, the code isn't merged and it's not deployed to the next environment? How do we do dynamic security testing as part of our checkout in QA? How do we ensure our threat modeling is up to date? Like, all of these things have to be worked into our CI process, into our agile methodology. And we need to get out of like these fiefdoms of security organizations and really get more integrated into engineering.
And in terms of that, I was curious with, when you're running security scans and you're looking at all the different threat assessments in there, is there also a role, and maybe this is in the mindset of breaking down those barriers between the silos, of understanding and prioritizing the threat assessments? So if you have maybe a service that's deep in the woods, has no egress or ingress, but it has a security vulnerability, but really no way for anyone on the outside to access it, knowing where that, how does a team know where that sits and to say, yes, this is a security threat, but it's not exposed and it's much lower priority than something that's maybe exposed to the outside world. Is that part of that cycle at this point? Or is that something even that's wise to be considering, if you understand what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I look at that as two aspects. Number one, like the team had like the same thing within functional testing, right? The testers have to understand the application architecture. They have to be able to understand what the APIs are doing, what different methods are doing, in order to be able to do more white box testing and more risk-based testing. And the same thing goes here. Security tests throw a lot of errors. There is going to be a lot of noise. And so the team needs to be empowered to be able to look through that. And yes, like you have to understand your application's architecture so that you can prioritize those findings better, so that way you know what you have to react to and what you don't have to react to. And this part goes to like in the early days, you would have somebody doing your dynamic security testing, and then they're going to come up with a report, and then you have to go through the report and then justify what your actions, like that just takes so much time. And so being able to really understand, being able to use like an APM tool to be able to model your application so you understand what your users are actually what areas of your application are being most used from your end user perspective, and then being able to prioritize your results based on that. I mean, there's a couple different methods there to make sure that you're able to react accordingly to the security threats that are most at risk.
Yeah, I see a lot of parallels between security testing and performance testing, coming down to understanding what you're testing for, understanding what your system is, understanding what it's designed to do. Like a classic example in performance testing is, testing a search function using unique searches 100% of the time. So nothing is cached, but it's not real world scenario of testing because people are going to be searching common terms, right? That's a very basic example, but I imagine in that security realm, it's very similar. You have to understand what you're trying to test, what you're looking for, and understanding that architecture of your systems to know when you have a flag raised up, where does that sit in the architecture and what that level of security is, or what that level of threat is in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think with everything that we're talking about, communication is key. Being able to talk through with architecture and engineering and security to understand exactly that model, that usage, like it's so important that it's not just, some group blindly going and trying to find vulnerabilities without really having context. I mean, I think this, like, it's an underlying theme in many of the things that we're doing nowadays, that we have to be talking, we have to be aligned, we have to understand, why are we doing something, so that way we can put the best plan forward, and then we all can be accountable for its success.
And when you talk about understanding DevOps, I think that's part of the core of DevOps is all the communication and collaboration between all the teams so that there's a unified effort. At least for me, that is,
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And it goes into, how the more educated the team is around things that they're not used to, how the network topology is architected, how the cloud VPCs are set up, why we're doing things from a security perspective or the data transports, the more educated they are on the systems that they weren't exposed to before, the better decisions that they can make as they're architecting new features for the platform versus, them doing something and then later on someone says, no, we can't do that. Or worst case, it goes all the way through production and it creates some type of risk and issue.
Hey, Adam, I know you said you started earlier explaining a little bit what type of security checks can be done in which, let's say, stages of your pipeline. But it would be interesting for me, and also I assume for the listeners, to try to figure out, okay, if they don't have any security tests right now and checks in the pipeline, what are the things, kind of the must-dos in each individual stage? So you mentioned earlier, what can the developer, for instance, do on their local workstation before even committing code, or what checks can be done and what tools can be used when they do a pull request, what can be done in a dev environment, in an integration environment. Is there any guidelines, any kind of it makes sense to do these types of security checks in this particular stage in order for you to capture enough, but yet not kind of wasting time on trying to find things that don't make sense in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the answer is yes. Obviously you should have, a perspective of what's the destination state for your pipeline. So that way you can have a repeatable pattern across. But definitely in the very beginning, there should be some type of threat modeling that you're looking at across your entire architecture. That's really going to drive your whole approach. Ideally, before commit, you're doing some type of vulnerability analysis, so SAST or maybe a open source scan. When you have your build, again, static security test and the open source test. Dynamic security testing, I would do a little later in the process after your pull request. Maybe after I'm doing some of my basic functional tests.
And just for clarification, dynamic security testing means you are doing pen testing. You're trying to figure out if you have any SQL injection issues or what's for those people that are not that familiar with security testing. What's the difference between static security testing and dynamic security testing? I know this is a basic question, but still valuable for our listeners.
Yeah, and I'm not I'm not a security engineer, so I hope I don't butcher the answer. But the way that I always look at it is static security testing is the code's at rest, right? So I'm going through the way the code is written, how my methods are interacting, and I'm looking for bad patterns. Where anti-patterns around how the code is written itself. And dynamic security testing is now the application is compiled, and I'm using the application itself to inject, like you said, SQL injection or trying to get the application to spit out codes or do something it shouldn't do and to expose a vulnerability.
So, Adam, any other testing that can then be done before an artifact hits production? Anything else we can do besides the dynamic testing that we just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the static security scanning at build time, being able to do code smells, being able to do the open source scans, all of that stuff should be done. Maybe even some risk profiling. And then the other thing here is secrets management. So making sure that IDs and whatnot aren't hard coded or being leveraged improperly. So there's probably a whole suite of other things that I'm missing, but I think those are the basic stuff.
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion we had. We had Kelsey Hightower on the previous podcast, and for those that sure Kelsey, the Mr. Kubernetes, and he's also talking more and more about security. And I thought part of the discussion that we had, because I asked him, so how does he see the future of Kubernetes? Will everybody just have a big Kubernetes cluster in production, and then you separate your stages in that cluster, like dev stage production? He said, no, that's not. Doesn't really make sense, because you obviously need to test all your different version updates beforehand, and not only that, you also need to test for any security vulnerabilities you bring in, not only by, let's say, upgrading your Kubernetes cluster to the latest version, but also by upgrading your operators, because a lot of people obviously on the Kubernetes world rely on operators that automate a lot of the tasks that has to do with lifecycle management of artifacts. And I was wondering, this was an interesting discussion. Have you seen especially in the Kubernetes world, your clients dealing with security, and if so, how? Are any things that might be different than what we just talked about, or is this just the same thing?
Well, I mean, I think it's a similar approach. I think the key would be like how you're managing your clusters. You should have a similar pipeline to be able to manage your upgrades and patches and be able to run different tests before integrating those changes into the other CI process. So that's the only thing is, in essence, you end up getting like almost everything has its own set of pipelines, right? And the similar processes for running tests and doing validation before it's being used by other people. And so that would be the key is creating the process where those things are happening, and then the engineering or the application team's pipelines are pulling from a repo that has already been certified. So that way those changes have gone through testing prior to the teams leveraging them.
Mm-hmm.
But Kubernetes, I mean, it definitely is, container. I won't talk to anybody about going to the cloud, even if they're still on-prem. Like the first step is containerization, and also modern, re-architecting their application perhaps to better take advantage of the containers before actually moving to the cloud. But Kubernetes right now is pretty much the standard.
Yeah. And now moving to the final stage, production. How do you deal with security there? And is there anything in particular that links it also to the DevOps pipeline? Is there anything where any best practices, anything you've seen out there, how you can also, let's say, first of all, obviously automate the detection of any security issues in prod as part of a delivery pipeline, but also feeding it back to pre-prod for the next cycle so that you can continuously innovate and continuously improve your DevTestSecOps practice?
Well, I mean, you definitely need to be doing monitoring and logging. There should probably be like recurring vulnerability scans on the apps and on the infrastructure itself, looking for compliance issues, intrusion detection, right? I mean, there's definitely things that you can be doing in production from a monitoring and operation perspective. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you do need to take these things back. You do need to be able to integrate them back into your pipeline. As new gates or new tests in order to close the loop. Being able to take those logs and be able to drive different new tests off of those is important. But yeah, I think in today's world, there's so much more happening in production, through telemetry and other types of tasks. I mean, that's how people are moving as fast as they can, is being able to move things into production and then be able to monitor and react very quickly, whether it's canary builds or blue-green or other items.
Mm-hmm. And also, and the audience doesn't know, but we had a side chat earlier, and I brought up our open source project, Captain, where it's an event-based system for continuous delivery, quality gates, and also auto remediation in production. One of the first adopters and one of the teams actually was very interested in Captain internally within Dynatrace, because we also use Captain internally, was our security team, trying to figure out how to integrate these different types of security checks, both in pre-prod, meaning as quality gates, where Captain will be able to pull data out of the security testing tools and then enforce quality gates, not only based on your functional metrics and your performance metrics, but also based on security assessments. But then the other use case was also, what if we detect a security vulnerability in production, and how can we then automatically remediate that security vulnerability. And depending on the vulnerability, obviously, there's different actions to take. But I would really be curious to have probably a follow-up discussion with you. And I know you said you have some other folks that are a little deeper in the weeds on the different toolings and the best practices and how we can potentially also integrate Captain better with other, security approaches. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a really valuable tool. We have something, it doesn't do the security remediation, but we have an open source tool called Report Portal. It's reportportal.io. And it's not branded EPAM. But it is one of our largest open source tools in the market. And it uses machine learning to help triage test results. And so it was born out of the need to triage failed UI automation. So as we all know, UI automation is very flaky. And so we wanted to dig in more to natural language processing. And so we used Elasticsearch, and we were able to build out this engine that you could plug in your functional automation tests, and it can learn how to recognize a framework issue versus an application issue versus a network issue, and really speed up the defect triage process. So in the last year, we've extended this open source tool to be able to do the same thing for security tests. So we have clients now that will plug in their security test results into Report Portal, and then Report Portal's natural language processing engine can start to determine what's a real failure versus what's a false fail, and then integrate back into your CI tool as well as your agile management tool, be able to create tickets and stop the process when there's an issue that recognizes that it has the need for inspection. And the whole purpose is being able to use Report Portal as a quality gate. Maybe there's an opportunity to look at that, but I definitely would like to see what you're doing with Captain as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, our approach in Captain is that you are defining your SLIs, your service level indicators, and then your SLOs, your objectives. And then the SLIs are tool independent, so you can pull in data from any type of tool, and then we automatically validate the calculate a score for the deployment, and then decide whether it's good or not. It seems like we should definitely talk. That's for sure. That's pretty cool. Wow, reportportal.io.
Yeah, and I don't want to diminish Captain at all. And Report Portal looks really cool because I love Captain. I've been playing with it a lot myself, but I do want to make a suggestion to the listeners that every time Andy brings up Captain, it's turned it into a drinking game. No, but Captain is wonderful. I'm not trying to put it down at all. I spent, as you know, Andy, I spent a good weekend messing around with it. But yeah, that's every time we're on a new episode, I'm like, when's it coming? When's it coming? Yeah. No, it's great. That's how we get the word out, right? Yeah. This Report Portal looks really, really cool. I just popped it up while you were while you were talking about that, Adam.
Hey, and Adam, I know also before we started the podcast recording, besides Report Portal.io, you also mentioned another open source project of yours.
Carrier or something, right?
Yeah, so it's called getcarrier.io, and getcarrier.io is a platform to help get you started in this journey. So it takes advantage of your cloud infrastructure and being able to spin up. You can use it for performance tests and security tests. So basically, you hook it into your CI. It allows you to spin up your security tests or your performance tests, run those tests, and then collect all the data in an InfluxDB. And then you have Grafana dashboards. It also comes out of the box with Report Portal, so you have that capability as well. And this is how we're helping get clients up and running with security and performance tests into their pipeline by being able to install this platform and then start building out tests and starting the execution. So it's been, like, we call it an accelerator because it really helps get you over that initial hump of getting things installed and figuring out how to integrate them. So here's all the most popular open source tools already integrated into a platform that you can just start to execute. You just need to have some tests to run.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I mean, it sounds like this covers a similar workflow and process what we are doing with Captain on a test, executing tests and then capturing the results and then deciding on whether it's good or not good build, basically dynamic build validation. That's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the key. I mean, when people originally started putting security tests into the pipeline, they would kick off the tests, but usually it's a separate pipeline, separate process, because someone would have to go through and figure out like, okay, what is all of these things? And that made it slower. It wasn't in the critical path. And then, starts to become a little bit more optional. And so there's been a lot of time spent like, okay, how do we make this process more automated so that way it can be, executed in that same process.
And it sounds like a lot of what you're doing is similar, again, drawing another parallel to the performance side, where we had the old-fashioned waterfall big bang performance test at the end of the cycle, which became a huge liability. So companies started foregoing that a lot of times, or trying to sneak builds past the performance team, sneak them out there and then pay the price when performance took a hit. And over time, how we've seen the performance practice change is going into much more smaller targeted testing, how to integrate that into the whole pipeline process so that it doesn't dramatically increase lead time. I feel like there's a strong parallel there with security testing where, normally, as you even said, a lot of people just put it in the non-critical path, or it's something that really slows down. And what it sounds like you all are doing is helping organizations find a way, or to implement those best practices, to work it into their pipeline and their workflow so that it does not become a huge end of the road test with a lot of unknowns, or gigantic report that you don't know which to address, putting it in at the right spots, making it actionable. But so that's going to help, I think, adoption of security. But I'm curious, from your experience, how many people are still coming into, let's reevaluate our security testing after they have an incident, versus how many organizations are being proactive and saying, we want to take this seriously, and before anything happens, let's start doing it right. Is there a trend changing there at this point in time?
It definitely is starting to change. Unfortunately, I think it's only now starting to change. I am seeing more RFPs come down the line that have security called out from the start. And those are companies that haven't yet, God forbid, had an incident. But there's still many companies that are waiting.
Cool.
And, if you're a financial institution, I think you've gotten the message at this point. But I think the other industries are still like hedging their bets.
Yeah, and we keep hearing about them. There was just that other one that, what was that company with all the facial recognition or the photos? They were tied to Facebook with the, they were doing a database of facial recognition. It was just in the news like 2 weeks ago. But they got hacked, and their huge database of people and all their pictures were stolen. And yeah, wonderful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, and we talked about this in the very beginning, at the end of the day, like, this takes an investment. This takes time and engineering. It takes dollars from the business to put this stuff in place. And so unfortunately, it's still somewhat of a prioritization call for the company to make this investment, because it's not as clear. Again, it's the same conversation that we had with performance testing. It's not as clear of a ROI, for their other features as secure tests. And so, again, depending on who's making those calls and how they prioritize, like it could be something that's just not in scope.
It's very similar to like a car analogy, right? Where you can build a car that goes 100 miles an hour and everyone loves it. But your performance testing is, well, what happens if it's raining outside? Can it perform in the rain? And security is, do you have airbags in it? Do you have tires that aren't going to rip apart? Do you have seatbelts? And these are the non-sexy parts about designing a really cool car. Just like everyone wants to create great software and put it out for everyone to use, but part of great software is it being performant and it being secure, and those are like the pieces that get no glory, and that also slows down that process. And I think where the industry is going right now is trying to find ways, and they're successfully finding ways, as evident with the change in performance testing and what you're doing with security, as to how to bake that in with much less of an impact as the traditional ways took.
Awesome. Hey, Adam, is there any final advice, any final thoughts on if people get started down that route of dev test SecOps practices that people need to know about?
The first thing is just to start small. Like static security scans are pretty straightforward. You can build it, Sonar Cube. If you're doing unit tests, you can start to build some of this stuff out. Just start working pieces of it into your process. And then you can start to move on from there. I think the other piece is like bringing security testing into the conversation. Like if there is some other group that's responsible for it, like bring them in, start setting expectations to them that, hey, like we're no longer going to be dependent on you to do this type of testing. So we need you to help integrate this into this process so that the teams can be more accountable. So to me, that's the two things I would start with. Start small, start getting integrated into your pull request process, and then start having some conversations around how to make it more automated and make the teams more accountable.
Cool.
That's amazing.
All right, Brian.
Yes. Are we summoning the summarator?
We're summoning the summarator.
It's been a while since the summarator.
I know, and I keep it short though, right? Are you ready?
Do it now.
I am ready. Are you ready?
All right. So folks, what I learned today, and Adam's is just the way how it works in the end. I'll try to summarize what I learned. And the DevTestSecOps practice is not just another cool marketing term that nobody understands what it really means, or people have a lot of different opinions, like with DevOps. I think that's what we learned today. But joke aside, I think what I learned today is that a lot of organizations still struggle with not knowing where their inefficiencies are, and that goes beyond security. And I really liked what you explained in the beginning, that bringing sometimes in an external group, company, person, consultant, in doing a value stream analysis and then figuring out how the processes works, how they can be automated and optimized, and then also thinking about how security can be baked into the process, but not like in the old days, like we did it with performance, where it was always at the end of the cycle and the big bang performance test, even though we didn't have time anyway. And at the end, everybody just gave the go because we had the kind of the milestone to reach. So I think just as we have done with performance over the last couple of years, where we shifted it left, broken it down into smaller pieces and automated into the pipeline, into the mindset of people, we have to do the same thing with security. I think we have to become more secure aware. We have to educate ourselves to become secure aware organizations, development organizations. And thanks for the overview of all the different options we have to integrate security into our delivery pipeline, whether it's static code analysis, threat modeling, vulnerability analysis, dynamic security testing. There's a lot of things you mentioned today. And also very happy that you mentioned your open source projects, Report, Portal.io, and GetCarrier.io. Would love to talk more with the folks behind these projects on your end. Also how we can integrate it into our open source project, Captain, because I think together we can come up with the tooling that will make it as easy as possible to automate the delivery pipeline and integrate the necessary testing in all different aspects, security, functional, and performance into the pipelines, so that bad code, whether it's bad performing or bad secured, will never make it into production. I think that's what I learned today. It's pretty awesome.
Well, thank you, Summerator. Yeah. I wanted to add one thing I learned today besides all that, just adding to a growing list of interests, coming from a performance testing background. We recently were speaking with Adrian Hornsby about resilient systems and chaos engineering. So that sparked my interest in terms of, if you're in the testing realm, when you then look at testing for resiliency, that's still a frame of work of testing. There's, that sort of scientific approach to let's set up things and test for it and then correct the results. And I think this security side of the testing adds to that. So, if you're in any of the testing realms, there seems to be quite a bit more that you can expand into or branch into. If you're not super excited about the testing realm you're in now, there are quite a lot of new things that people are finally starting to adopt seriously that all seem very exciting to me. So hopefully they sound exciting to other people. Plenty to learn and plenty of ways to grow and further your career by looking into some of these other things and becoming part of that team. Not only will it just help your organization as a whole, the more you're aware of all these other things, but you might find yourself more attracted to one of these other areas that you may want to grow into. So always worth looking into and learning something new. Adam, thanks a lot for being a repeat guest 3 years apart, but it was great that you came back. So thank you very much for being here again today and letting us, educating us on some of the security stuff.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, the opportunity.
Great. Hopefully we'll talk to you soon and maybe not
Another 3 years.
Well, maybe not 3 years. But yeah, anytime you got something new, or, one thing we love, and we're going to try to get some more on, we have a guest coming up in a few episodes who's going to tell us some more, any good war stories. If you, obviously you can't talk about any specific organizations, but if you have any interesting stories from the field, we'd love to have you back on to find out what happened, what lessons learned were, and how people can maybe avoid or learn from an example that might have happened you might have encountered in the real world. So if before 3 years something cool comes up, definitely reach out to us. We'd love to have you back on.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.